At my grandson's graduation party, my daughter-in-law Jessica rolled her eyes when I mentioned my investment portfolio. She turned to her friends and said, "Grandma still thinks savings bonds are cutting-edge technology." Everyone laughed. I smiled politely, but something inside me shifted. 3 months later, I sat across from my lawyer and quietly updated my will. When they finally saw the numbers, Jessica's face went white. She asked how I had accumulated so much wealth without them knowing. I simply handed her the revised documents and said, "Maybe Grandma isn't as outdated as you thought." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Crishele Martinez, and I was 73 years old when my family decided I had become irrelevant. I lived in Coral Springs, Florida, in a house I had called home for 42 years. The neighborhood had changed around me, filling with young families who drove luxury SUVs and spoke in acronyms I pretended to understand. But my house remained constant, a Spanish-style refuge with coral-colored walls and a garden that bloomed year-round in the endless Florida sunshine. I wasn't the kind of grandmother who baked cookies or knitted sweaters, though I had done both in my younger years. I was the kind who read financial newspapers over morning coffee, who understood compound interest before it became a social media buzzword, and who had been quietly building wealth while everyone assumed I was just getting by on Social Security and my late husband's pension. Roberto had been gone for 8 years now, and in that time, I had learned to navigate the world of investments, real estate, and financial planning with a precision that would have surprised anyone who knew me only as Michael's mother or Emma and Tyler's grandmother. My daily routine was simple but purposeful. I woke before sunrise, not because I couldn't sleep, but because I enjoyed the stillness of early morning. I would brew Cuban coffee in the same stovetop espresso maker I had used for decades, strong and sweet, and sit on my back patio watching the sun paint the sky pink and orange above the canal behind my house. The water was always calm in those early hours, reflecting the palm trees and the occasional heron that came to fish in the shallows. I kept my financial documents in a locked file cabinet in what used to be Roberto's office. Every morning after coffee, I would review my portfolio, check the markets, and make notes in a leather-bound journal that looked unremarkable but contained detailed records of every investment decision I had made since becoming a widow. I had taught myself to read balance sheets and annual reports. I subscribed to financial publications that arrived in plain brown envelopes. I attended investment seminars at the library and took notes in the back row where no one paid attention, to the elderly Hispanic woman with silver hair and sensible shoes. The house itself was a testament to my practical nature. I had paid off the mortgage 15 years early, back when Roberto was still alive and we were both working. The kitchen had been updated twice, not for luxury but for efficiency. The floors were original terrazzo, polished to a warm glow that never seemed to fade. The furniture was solid, well-made pieces I had chosen to last. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed wealth, just quality items that served their purpose year after year. My neighbors knew me as the quiet woman who kept her lawn immaculate and her property values high. Mrs. Rodriguez next door often commented on how well-maintained everything looked, how the landscaping never seemed to need work, how the paint never seemed to chip or fade. What she didn't know was that I had learned to do most of the maintenance myself, not from necessity, but from a desire to understand every aspect of homeownership. I could fix a leaky faucet, replace weather stripping, and negotiate with contractors when the job was beyond my physical capabilities. I drove a 10-year-old Honda Civic that I had bought new and maintained religiously. It wasn't the kind of car that turned heads or made statements, but it was reliable and paid for. I had no car payment, no credit card debt, no financial obligations. That kept me awake at night. Freedom, I had learned, wasn't about having the most expensive things. It was about having choices, about not being dependent on anyone else's approval or assistance. My relationship with my family had always been cordial but distant, Michael lived 20 minutes away in a gated community with houses that looked like hotels and HOA fees that exceeded my monthly grocery budget. He worked in pharmaceutical sales and drove a BMW that he replaced every 3 years. Jessica, his wife, had never worked outside the home, but spent money like someone who had earned every penny herself. They lived in a world of appearances, of keeping up with neighbors whose names they probably didn't know, but whose lifestyles they felt compelled to match. Emma was 16 and Tyler was 14, and I saw them mainly at birthday parties and holidays, supervised visits where conversation was polite but surface level. They were good kids, raised with every advantage but seemingly unaware of the value of money or the effort required to earn it. Emma wanted to be an influencer, whatever that meant. Tyler played expensive video games on equipment that cost more than my first car. They were products of their environment, and I didn't blame them for their innocence about financial reality. The family gatherings always followed the same pattern. I would arrive with a modest gift, something practical that would be received with forced smiles and quickly forgotten. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The conversation would revolve around their latest purchases, their vacation plans, their social activities. I would listen politely, ask appropriate questions, and offer encouragement when it seemed warranted. But I never shared details about my own financial situation. It wasn't their business, and frankly, I didn't think they would believe me if I told them. There were subtle signs of their attitude toward me, small comments that revealed their assumptions about my circumstances. Jessica would suggest I shop at discount stores or use coupons, as if I were struggling to make ends meet. Michael would offer to help with household repairs, implying that I couldn't afford to hire professionals. They spoke slowly when discussing anything technical, as if age had diminished my ability to understand basic concepts. Their concern was genuine but misguided, based on stereotypes about elderly widows rather than knowledge of my actual situation. I had stopped trying to correct their misconceptions years ago. It was easier to let them believe what they wanted to believe than to deal with their surprise and inevitable questions about how I had managed to accumulate wealth they couldn't. See? My lifestyle was deliberately modest, not because I had to be careful with money, but because I preferred simplicity. I had learned that true security came from having more than you needed, not from spending everything you earned trying to impress people who weren't paying attention anyway. The irony wasn't lost on me. While they struggled with mortgages and car payments and credit card balances, while they worked constantly to maintain their image and keep up with their neighbors, I lived without financial stress. I could afford their lifestyle several times over, but I had chosen something different. I had chosen peace of mind over prestige, stability over status symbols. My investment strategy was conservative but consistent. I favored dividend-paying stocks, municipal bonds, and real estate investment trusts. I had learned to ignore market volatility and focus on long-term growth. I reinvested earnings automatically and added to my positions regularly. Over the years, compound interest had worked its quiet magic, turning modest contributions into substantial wealth. The real estate market in South Florida had been particularly kind to me. I owned 3 rental properties in addition to my home, small houses in working-class neighborhoods that provided steady income and appreciated steadily in value. I managed them myself, screening tenants carefully and maintaining the properties to high standards. The rental income covered all my living expenses and then some, allowing my investment portfolio to grow undisturbed. I had also inherited more than my family realized when Roberto died. His life insurance policy had been substantial, and he had been saving and investing long before I took an interest in financial matters. What they saw as a modest pension was actually just a small portion of our total assets. The rest was invested in accounts they didn't know existed, growing quietly while they assumed I was living paycheck to paycheck. But perhaps the most valuable thing I had accumulated wasn't money at all. It was knowledge. I understood how wealth was created and preserved. I knew the difference between being rich and being wealthy. I had learned to think long-term, to be patient, to ignore the noise and focus on fundamentals. These were lessons I had hoped to pass on to my family, but they had never shown any interest in learning. Instead, they saw an outdated old woman who didn't understand modern life. They saw someone who needed their guidance and protection, someone whose opinions could be dismissed with a patronizing smile. They saw a grandmother who was sweet but irrelevant, a relic from a simpler time who couldn't possibly understand the complexities of contemporary finance. What they didn't see was the sharp mind that had been learning and growing while they assumed I was declining. They didn't see the careful planning that had gone into every financial decision I had made since becoming a widow. They didn't see the discipline it took to live below my means while building wealth for the future. They didn't see the strength it took to smile politely while they explained things to me that I understood better than they did. The morning sun was getting higher now, and the herons had finished their fishing. I closed my financial journal and locked it back in the file cabinet. Another day was beginning, another day of being underestimated and overlooked. But I wasn't bothered by their ignorance anymore. I had something they didn't have, the security that comes from being truly prepared for whatever the future might bring. I poured another cup of coffee and walked through my house, looking at the familiar rooms with fresh eyes. This wasn't just a house anymore. It was the foundation of something larger, something they couldn't see but would eventually have to acknowledge. I had built more than they imagined, and soon, very soon, they would understand exactly what Grandma had been doing all these years while they thought she was becoming irrelevant. The phone rang, breaking the morning silence. It was Michael, calling to remind me about Tyler's graduation party next weekend. His voice was cheerful but hurried, the tone of someone checking an item off a to-do list. I listened as he explained the details, the time, the location, what to bring. He didn't ask about my week or how I was feeling. He didn't inquire about my plans or my thoughts on anything that mattered. I was simply expected to show up, smile appropriately, and blend into the background like a piece of furniture that had sentimental value but no real function. After I hung up, I stood by the window looking out at my garden. The bougainvillea was blooming purple and bright, climbing the fence I had installed myself 3 summers ago. The grass was thick and green, fed by the sprinkler system I had learned to program and maintain. Everything looked perfect, well cared for, prosperous. But they saw only what they expected to see, an old woman puttering around a house that was probably too much for her to handle. I smiled to myself as I imagined their faces when they finally learned the truth. Not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I was curious to see how quickly their attitude would change when they realized their assumptions had been completely wrong. Money, I had learned, had a way of making people suddenly very interested in your opinions. But that revelation was still in the future. For now, I would continue to be the grandmother they expected me to be, quiet, grateful for their attention, and apparently in need of their guidance. I would nod politely when they explained things I already knew. I would accept their well-meaning but misguided advice with grace. And I would continue to build the foundation for a surprise that would change everything they thought they knew about me. The day stretched ahead of me, full of ordinary tasks and simple pleasures. I had groceries to buy, bills to pay, investments to review. I had a life to live that was rich in ways they couldn't imagine, fulfilled in ways that had nothing to do with their approval or understanding. I had learned to find joy in my own company, satisfaction in my own accomplishments, and security in my own careful planning. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, new challenges, new chances to prove to myself that age was just a number, and wisdom was something you earned, not something you lost. But today, I would simply enjoy the sunshine, tend my garden, and prepare for the moment when everything would change. Tyler's graduation party was held at the Coral Springs Country Club, a sprawling complex with manicured golf courses and a dining room that overlooked an artificial lake dotted with swans. I arrived exactly on time, wearing a navy blue dress I had owned for years but still looked elegant, paired with pearl earrings Roberto had given me for our 20th anniversary. I carried a modest gift bag containing a leather portfolio for Tyler's college documents and a savings bond worth $500, the kind of practical present that would be politely received and quickly forgotten. The parking lot was filled with expensive cars, mostly SUVs and luxury sedans that gleamed in the afternoon sun. I parked my Honda between a Range Rover and a Tesla, feeling like a sparrow among peacocks. The contrast didn't bother me anymore. I had long ago stopped caring about what my car said about me. It was reliable, economical, and paid for, which said everything I needed it to say. Inside, the party was already in full swing. Round tables draped in white linen were scattered throughout the room, each decorated with centerpieces of yellow, roses and baby's breath. The bar was busy, and servers moved efficiently between tables carrying trays of appetizers that looked more like art than food. I recognized most of the faces, neighbors from Michael's subdivision, colleagues from his office, parents of Tyler's classmates. Everyone looked successful and satisfied, the kind of people who had never questioned their place in the world or wondered if they were living beyond their means. Michael spotted me first and approached with his usual hurried smile, the one that said he was genuinely happy to see me but had 12 other things on his mind. He kissed my cheek and guided me toward the family table, speaking quickly about the timeline for the afternoon, when Tyler would give his speech, when the cake would be served, when the photographer would want to take group pictures. I nodded and smiled, letting his words wash over me like background music. Jessica appeared moments later, resplendent in a coral-colored dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She air-kissed me carefully, avoiding contact with her makeup, and complimented my dress in the tone people use when they're trying to be encouraging about something they don't actually admire. She guided me to my assigned seat, which was at the family table but positioned so I had a clear view of Tyler's achievements board while being slightly removed from the main conversation flow. The table was filled with Jessica's friends, women. I had met at previous family gatherings but never really gotten to know. They spoke in the rapid, overlapping style of people who were used to being heard, discussing vacation plans, children's accomplishments, and the latest developments in their various social circles. I listened politely, contributing when directly addressed but mostly observing the dynamics of this world my family had chosen to inhabit. Tyler looked handsome in his navy blazer and school tie, mature beyond his 14 years, but still carrying the soft-cheeked innocence of childhood. He was clearly enjoying being the center of attention, moving between tables to accept congratulations and pose for pictures. Emma followed him like a shadow, taking photos with her phone and posting them immediately to whatever social media platform was currently capturing her attention. They were good kids, I reminded myself, products of privilege, but not yet corrupted by it. The conversation at my table turned to summer plans, and Jessica launched into an elaborate description of their upcoming vacation to Europe. 3 weeks visiting London, Paris, and Rome, staying in boutique hotels and eating at restaurants that required reservations made months in advance. She pulled out her phone to show pictures of their accommodations, swiping through images of marble bathrooms and rooms with views of famous landmarks. One of her friends, a blonde woman whose name I could never remember, expressed envy about the trip and wondered aloud how anyone could afford such luxury in the current economy. Jessica laughed and said something about priorities, about how important it was to expose children to culture and history. Another friend mentioned the cost of international travel, and Jessica waved dismissively, saying they had been planning and saving for years. Then the conversation took a turn that made my stomach tighten. Someone asked about taking elderly parents on such trips and whether the physical demands would be too much. Jessica glanced in my direction and shook her head sympathetically. She said something about how older people were often set in their ways, resistant to new experiences, and more comfortable with familiar routines. She mentioned that I preferred to stay close to home, as if this were a limitation rather than a choice. The blonde woman nodded understandingly and shared a story about her own mother, who refused to fly anywhere because she didn't trust modern technology. This led to a general discussion about the challenges of dealing with elderly relatives who hadn't kept up with the times. They spoke about resistance to smartphones, confusion about online banking, and the stubborn insistence on doing things the old-fashioned way even when newer methods were clearly superior. I sat quietly, cutting my salmon into small pieces and letting their words settle around me like dust. They weren't being deliberately cruel, I realized. They genuinely believed they were having a compassionate conversation about the inevitable decline that comes with age. They saw themselves as patient and understanding, dealing gracefully with family members who had become technological dinosaurs. The fact that I was sitting right there, listening to every word, seemed to have escaped their notice entirely. Jessica's voice rose slightly as she warmed to her subject. She talked about trying to help me understand modern financial planning, about her attempts to explain why I should consider moving my money from savings accounts into more sophisticated investment vehicles. She laughed as she described my apparent confusion about online banking, my preference for paper statements, and my insistence on visiting the bank in person for transactions that could easily be handled electronically. Her friends made sympathetic noises and shared similar stories about elderly relatives who hoarded cash under mattresses or kept all their money in savings accounts, earning practically nothing in interest. Someone mentioned the importance of financial education for seniors, and Jessica agreed enthusiastically. She said she had tried to explain concepts like mutual funds and retirement planning, but that I seemed overwhelmed by the complexity. The conversation continued in this vein for several minutes, with each woman contributing examples of elderly family members who had become financial burdens or made poor decisions due to their outdated understanding of money management. They spoke with the confidence of people who had never questioned their own expertise, who assumed that youth and education automatically translated into wisdom. I continued eating, my face maintaining a pleasant expression while my mind processed every word. They had no idea that I understood exactly what they were discussing, that I had been implementing sophisticated investment strategies while they were still learning to balance their checkbooks. They couldn't conceive that someone my age might actually know more about building wealth than they did. Tyler's speech interrupted their financial education seminar. He stood at a small podium near the windows, looking nervous but determined. He thanked everyone for coming and talked about his excitement for high school, his plans for the future, and his gratitude for his family's support. He was articulate and charming, and I felt a genuine surge of pride watching him. When he finished, the room erupted in applause, and I clapped enthusiastically along with everyone else. During the applause, I noticed Jessica lean toward her blonde friend and make a comment that I couldn't quite hear over the noise. The friend laughed and nodded, glancing in my direction with an expression that mixed amusement with pity. I had a sinking feeling that I had just become the subject of another example in their ongoing discussion about the challenges of aging relatives. The cake ceremony followed Tyler's speech, and I watched as Jessica and Michael helped him cut. An elaborate 3-layer creation decorated with his school colors and topped with a fondant replica of his diploma. The photographer captured every moment, directing the family into various poses while guests gathered around to watch. I was included in the group shots, positioned at the edge where I could be easily cropped out if necessary. After the formal photos, the party began to wind down. Adults lingered over coffee and dessert while children ran around the lawn outside, their voices carried on the warm evening breeze. I found myself sitting alone at the table, watching the easy interaction of people who belong to this world. In a way, I never would. They spoke the same language, shared the same values, understood the same references. I was a tolerated outsider, present by familial obligation, but not really part of the group. Michael approached as I was finishing my coffee, carrying a plate of cake I hadn't requested. He sat down beside me with the careful attention of someone fulfilling a duty, asking if I had enjoyed the party and whether I needed help getting to my car. His concern was genuine but distant, The kind of polite attention you might pay to an elderly neighbor who had wandered into your event by mistake. I assured him that I was fine and complimented the party, praising Tyler's speech and the lovely venue. Michael smiled and launched into an explanation of the costs involved, mentioning the price of the club rental, the catering fees, and the photographer's charges with the casual air of someone who wanted to be seen as successful but not boastful. He was clearly proud of his ability to provide such an event for his son, and I was happy for him. But then the conversation took another uncomfortable turn. Michael began talking about future expenses, college tuition, and the importance of financial planning. He mentioned his concerns about Tyler's lack of interest in practical matters, his tendency to assume money would always be available for whatever he wanted. Michael said he was trying to teach both children about budgeting and responsibility, but that it was difficult when they had never experienced any real financial constraints. This led him to reminisce about his own childhood, about the lessons. I had tried to teach him about the value of money and the importance of hard work. He spoke with affection, but also with a subtle condescension, as if those lessons had been charming, but ultimately naive. He talked about how much more complicated financial planning had become since I was younger, how the investment options available today were far more sophisticated than anything I could have imagined. He mentioned his own portfolio, managed by a professional advisor who understood the complexities of modern markets. He talked about diversification strategies and tax optimization techniques with the enthusiasm of someone who had recently learned new vocabulary and wanted to demonstrate his mastery. He suggested that I might benefit from professional financial advice, someone who could help me understand the opportunities I was missing by keeping my money in simple savings accounts. I listened patiently, nodding at appropriate moments and asking occasional questions that seemed to confirm his assumptions about my level of understanding. I didn't correct his misconceptions about my financial sophistication or challenge his advice about investment strategies I had been implementing for years. Instead, I let him feel helpful and knowledgeable, playing the role of the grateful but confused elderly relative who needed guidance from younger, smarter family members. As the party finally began to break up, I said my goodbyes and collected my purse and the small gift bag I had brought but hadn't yet given to Tyler. I found him near the dessert table, surrounded by friends who were sampling the leftover cake and discussing their plans for the summer. He brightened when he saw me and accepted my gift with the practiced grace of someone who had been opening presents all afternoon. He thanked me politely and set the bag aside with the others, clearly planning to open everything later when the excitement had died down. I kissed his cheek and told him how proud I was, how excited I was to see what he would accomplish in high school. He smiled and hugged me briefly before turning back to his friends, already moving on to the next conversation. Jessica appeared as I was preparing to leave, slightly breathless from coordinating the end-of-party logistics. She thanked me for coming and mentioned how much it meant to Tyler to have his grandmother there. Then, almost as an afterthought, she brought up something that made my chest tighten with suppressed irritation. She had been talking to her financial advisor, she said, and he had mentioned some new programs specifically designed for senior citizens who needed help managing their money. These programs offered simplified investment options and educational resources for people who felt overwhelmed by modern financial planning. She thought I might be interested in learning more, given my apparent confusion about contemporary investment strategies. She spoke with the earnest enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed she was being helpful. She mentioned how important it was for elderly people to have professional guidance, especially widows who might not have experience with financial decision-making. She said her advisor had specifically mentioned the risks of keeping too much money in savings accounts, where inflation could slowly erode its value over time. I thanked her for her concern and promised to consider her suggestion, maintaining the pleasant expression I had worn throughout the afternoon. Inside, I was calculating exactly how much my supposedly inadequate investment portfolio had earned just in the past month, probably more than her advisor charged in annual fees for his sophisticated guidance. As I walked to my car, I could hear fragments of conversation from other departing guests. Someone was complaining about the difficulty of finding good help for elderly parents. Someone else was discussing the challenge of convincing older relatives to embrace technology. The general theme seemed to be the burden of dealing with family members who had failed to keep pace with modern life. I sat in my Honda for several minutes before starting the engine, letting the air conditioning cool the interior while I processed what I had experienced. The afternoon had been a masterclass in condescension, a gentle but thorough dismissal of everything I represented. I had been patted on the head, spoken down to, and generally treated like a pleasant but incompetent child who needed constant supervision and guidance. The drive home was quiet, the roads familiar and comforting after the artificial environment of the country club. I passed the strip malls and residential developments that had grown up around my neighborhood over the years, evidence of the prosperity that had transformed this part of Florida from swampland into suburban paradise. My house, when I finally pulled into the driveway, looked smaller and more modest than ever, surrounded by newer homes with grander facades and more expensive landscaping. But inside, everything was exactly as I had left it. The financial documents in Roberto's office, the investment accounts that grew steadily regardless of what anyone thought about my competence, the careful records of a wealth-building strategy that had been decades in the making. Tomorrow, I would review my portfolio, check on my rental properties, and continue the patient work of accumulating assets while everyone assumed I was struggling to get by. Tonight, however, I would sit on my back patio with a glass of wine and think about what I had learned at Tyler's party. Not about investments or financial planning, but about family dynamics and the assumptions people make based on age and appearance. I had been given a clear picture of how I was perceived, and while it stung, it also clarified something important. They didn't see me as a person with agency, wisdom, or capability. They saw me as a relic, a sweet but declining presence who needed their patience and guidance. And perhaps, I thought as I unlocked my front door, it was time to show them exactly how wrong they were about that. The Monday morning after Tyler's party, I woke before dawn with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The house was still dark, the only sound the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant splash of a fish jumping in the canal behind my property. I made my coffee in the familiar ritual that had started every day for the past 8 years, but this time there was a different energy in my movements, a sense of purpose that had crystallized overnight. I sat on my back patio as the sky slowly lightened, watching a great blue heron wade through the shallow water near my dock. The bird moved with patient deliberation, each step calculated and purposeful. It knew exactly what it was hunting for and would wait as long as necessary to achieve its goal. I found myself admiring that quality, that ability to remain still and focused while others rushed around creating unnecessary commotion. The weekend's events had settled in my mind like sediment in still water, leaving behind a clear understanding of my situation. For years, I had allowed my family to maintain their comfortable illusions about my capabilities and circumstances. I had smiled politely while they explained concepts I understood better than they did. I had accepted their well-meaning, but misguided advice with grace. I had played the role of the sweet, slightly confused grandmother who needed their guidance and protection. But Tyler's graduation party had been a revelation. Listening to Jessica and her friends discuss elderly relatives like burdensome children who couldn't be trusted to make their own decisions had opened my eyes to something I had been avoiding. I wasn't just being underestimated. I was being systematically dismissed, written off as irrelevant to any important family decisions because of assumptions they had made about my mental acuity and financial sophistication. The realization didn't make me angry, exactly. Anger was a hot emotion, and what I felt was cooler, more controlled. I felt a quiet determination, the kind that comes from finally understanding exactly what needs to be done and being prepared to do it methodically and completely. I wasn't interested in confrontation or dramatic gestures. I was interested in clarity, in creating a situation where the truth would speak for itself without requiring explanation or defense. I finished my coffee and walked into Roberto's office, unlocking the file cabinet that contained my financial records. The morning light streaming through the window illuminated folders full of statements, tax returns, and investment summaries that told the real story of my life since becoming a widow. These documents represented not just money, but decisions, made carefully over years of patient planning. They were proof of competence, evidence of sophisticated thinking, documentation of success achieved without fanfare or recognition. I pulled out my latest portfolio summary and spread the pages. Across Roberto's old desk, the numbers were impressive even to me, representing a level of wealth that most people would find surprising in someone of my modest lifestyle. My investment accounts alone contained more money than Michael and Jessica probably imagined I had ever seen, let alone accumulated through my own efforts. The rental properties added another substantial layer of assets, and my home itself had appreciated far beyond what anyone in my family realized. But the raw numbers were only part of the story. More important was the strategy behind them, the careful research and planning that had guided every decision. I had built this wealth not through luck or inheritance, though Roberto's life insurance had certainly helped, but through understanding principles that apparently escaped my financially sophisticated family members. I had learned to think in decades rather than quarters, to focus on fundamental value rather than market trends, to reinvest earnings rather than spend them on lifestyle inflation. The irony was striking. While Jessica worried about my outdated understanding of money management, I had been implementing a wealth-building strategy that had outperformed most professional advisors. While Michael explained the complexities of modern financial planning, I had been quietly accumulating assets that dwarfed his impressive but heavily leveraged lifestyle. While they assumed I was financially naive, I had been making investment decisions that demonstrated a level of sophistication they couldn't have imagined. I spent the morning reviewing every aspect of my financial situation, not because I needed to verify the numbers, but because I wanted to understand exactly what I was working with. The rental properties were all in excellent condition, fully rented to reliable tenants who had been with me for years. The investment accounts were well diversified across asset classes and sectors, positioned to generate income while preserving capital. The home was mortgage-free and maintained to standards that would impress any appraiser. More importantly, I had liquidity. Unlike many wealthy people who were asset-rich but cash-poor, I had substantial funds available for immediate use. This flexibility gave me options that most people didn't have, the ability to make decisions without worrying about timing or market conditions. I could act quickly and decisively when the right opportunity presented itself. By noon, I had completed my financial review and reached a decision that felt both inevitable and liberating. I was going to update my will, not out of spite or vindictiveness, but out of a desire to ensure that my assets would be distributed according to my values rather than their assumptions. If my family believed I was incompetent to manage money, perhaps they weren't the best choices to inherit the substantial wealth I had accumulated through that supposed incompetence. I called my attorney's office and scheduled an appointment for later in the week. Mr. Thompson had been handling my legal affairs since Roberto's death, and I trusted his judgment and discretion. He had helped me structure my rental property, ownership to minimize taxes and protect my assets. He understood my financial situation better than anyone in my family, because he had actually taken the time to listen when I explained my investment philosophy and long-term goals. The rest of the week passed quietly as I considered exactly how I wanted to restructure my estate plan. I wasn't interested in punishing anyone or creating family drama. I was interested in aligning my legacy with my values, ensuring that my wealth would be used by people who understood its true worth and could be trusted to manage it responsibly. I thought about charitable organizations that shared my commitment to financial education and senior empowerment. I researched scholarship programs that helped first-generation college students learn about money management and investing. I investigated foundations that provided financial literacy training to women who had lost spouses and needed to take control of their economic future. These causes resonated with me because they addressed the very assumptions that had led to my family's misconceptions about my capabilities. Thursday morning arrived gray and humid, with thunderclouds building on the horizon that promised afternoon storms. I dressed carefully for my appointment with Mr. Thompson, choosing a navy suit that projected competence and authority. I gathered the documents I would need and drove downtown to his office, a modest but well-appointed suite in a building that had been renovated rather than replaced, much like the financial strategy that had brought me to this point. Mr. Thompson was a man in his 60s who had earned his reputation through careful work rather than flashy marketing. His office walls were lined with legal books and family photos, and his desk was covered with the organized chaos of someone who handled multiple clients but never lost track of important details. He greeted me warmly and offered coffee, which I accepted gratefully. We began with small talk about the weather and mutual acquaintances, but I could tell he was curious about the purpose of my visit. I had been vague on the phone about wanting to review my estate planning, and he probably assumed I needed minor adjustments rather than major restructuring. When I explained that I wanted to make substantial changes to my will, his eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professional and attentive. I told him about the graduation party, about the conversations I had overheard, about the assumptions my family had made regarding my financial competence. I explained that I had come to realize that people who viewed me as incapable of managing money probably shouldn't be entrusted with inheriting the substantial wealth I had accumulated. Mr. Thompson listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes but mostly just paying attention to what I was saying and how I was saying it. When I finished explaining my reasoning, he was quiet for several moments. Then he asked a series of careful questions designed to ensure that I was thinking clearly and making decisions based on sound reasoning rather than temporary emotional responses. He wanted to understand whether this was a reaction to a single incident or the culmination of long-standing concerns about my family's attitudes and behaviors. I appreciated his thoroughness because it forced me to articulate exactly why I was taking this step. It wasn't about revenge or hurt feelings. It was about values and responsibility. If my family couldn't respect my judgment while I was alive, how could I trust them to honor my intentions after I was gone? If they viewed me as a financial liability rather than an asset, why should I make them beneficiaries of the wealth I had built through supposedly inadequate money management skills? Mr. Thompson nodded thoughtfully as I explained my new vision for my estate. Rather than leaving everything to family members who had dismissed my capabilities, I wanted to create a legacy that would actually make a difference in the world. I wanted to fund scholarship programs that would help other elderly women learn to manage their finances independently. I wanted to support organizations that challenged ageist assumptions about seniors and their abilities. I wanted to leave my rental properties to tenants who had been reliable and respectful, giving them the opportunity to build wealth through homeownership. We spent the next 2 hours working through the details of my new estate plan. Mr. Thompson was careful to ensure that my family wouldn't be left entirely without inheritance, but the bulk of my assets would go to causes and people who would appreciate their true value. He explained the legal implications of my choices and helped me structure the bequests in ways that would minimize taxes and maximize impact. The most significant change involved my house and investment accounts, which represented the majority of my wealth. Instead of leaving these assets to Michael and Jessica, who would probably sell everything immediately to fund their lifestyle, I was creating a foundation that would use the income to provide financial education and support to elderly women who found themselves widowed or divorced later in life. The foundation would be managed by professionals who understood both investing and the unique challenges faced by older women in our society. Mr. Thompson also helped me structure specific bequests that would make my point without being cruel. Tyler and Emma would each receive substantial college funds, but the money would be managed by trustees who would ensure it was used for education rather than lifestyle expenses. Michael would inherit enough to pay off his mortgage and car loans, eliminating his debt but not funding continued extravagance. Jessica would receive a modest sum along with a letter explaining my reasoning for the revised distribution. As we worked through the details, I felt a sense of relief that surprised me with its intensity. For years, I had been carrying the burden of pretending to be less than I was, of allowing others to underestimate my capabilities while I quietly managed substantial wealth. Now I was taking action that would eventually reveal the truth, but in a way that would also create lasting positive impact rather than just making a point. The afternoon thunderstorm arrived as we were finishing our work, sending sheets of rain against the office windows and temporarily darkening the sky. I found the dramatic weather appropriate to the magnitude of the decisions I was making. This wasn't a minor adjustment to my estate plan. This was a complete reimagining of my legacy, a transformation from passive victim of ageist assumptions to active advocate for change. Mr. Thompson promised to have the revised documents ready for my signature within a week. He would prepare multiple copies and ensure that everything was properly witnessed and notarized. He also suggested that I write personal letters to my family members explaining my reasoning, documents that could be sealed with the will and delivered after my death. This would give me the opportunity to explain my choices without having to endure the emotional confrontations that would inevitably follow such revelations. As I drove home through the clearing storm, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. The oppressive weight of maintaining false modesty about my accomplishments had been lifted. I no longer had to pretend to be confused by concepts I understood perfectly. I no longer had to accept condescending advice about financial matters I had mastered decades ago. I no longer had to smile politely while people discussed my limitations as if I weren't sitting right there listening to every word. The house welcomed me back with its familiar comfort, but everything felt different. Now, this wasn't just my home anymore. It was the foundation of a legacy that would outlast the assumptions and misconceptions that had shaped how others saw me. The rental properties weren't just investments anymore. They were tools for creating opportunities for people who had been overlooked and underestimated. The investment accounts weren't just numbers on statements anymore. They were resources that would fund education and empowerment for generations of women who deserved better than dismissal and condescension. That evening, I sat on my back patio with a glass of wine and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The canal was calm again after the storm, reflecting the changing colors like a mirror. The heron had returned to its fishing spot, moving through the shallow water with the same patient determination I had admired that morning. I thought about the letter I would write to Michael, explaining why I had made these choices and what I hoped he would learn from them. I thought about Jessica's reaction when she discovered that the supposedly incompetent old woman she had been trying to educate about financial planning had actually accumulated more wealth than she could imagine. I thought about Tyler and Emma growing up to understand that their grandmother had been someone worth respecting, not just tolerating. But mostly I thought about the freedom that comes from finally deciding to stop hiding who you really are. Tomorrow I would wake up as the same person I had been for years, but without the burden of pretending to be less capable, less intelligent, or less worthy of respect than I actually was. I would continue to live modestly and manage my wealth carefully, but I would no longer apologize for my success or downplay my accomplishments to make others comfortable. The transformation was complete, even though no one else knew it yet. I had moved from passive acceptance of their misconceptions to active preparation for revealing the truth. Soon enough, they would understand exactly what they had been dismissing all these years. Soon enough, they would realize that Grandma wasn't outdated at all. She had just been waiting for the right moment to update her will and show them what real financial sophistication looked like. The phone call came on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks after I had signed my revised will. I was sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing quarterly statements from my investment accounts, when Michael's number appeared on my caller ID. His voice carried an unusual tension that immediately caught my attention, a strained quality that suggested he was dealing with something beyond his usual routine concerns. He explained that Jessica's father had suffered a heart attack and was in intensive care at Miami General Hospital. The family was gathering there, and they needed to make some quick financial decisions about his care. Jessica was overwhelmed. Her mother was hysterical, and they were facing immediate expenses that their insurance wouldn't fully cover. Michael's voice cracked slightly as he explained that they were short on readily available cash due to some recent investments that couldn't be liquidated quickly. I listened carefully, asking appropriate questions about the medical situation and expressing genuine concern for Jessica's father, whom I had met several times and found to be a decent man. But as Michael continued talking, it became clear that this wasn't just a call to inform me about a family emergency. He was working up to asking for financial help, though he was having difficulty finding the words to make such a request from someone he believed had limited resources. Finally, he managed to explain that they needed to come up with $30,000 within the next few days to cover deductibles, co-pays, and some experimental treatments that might improve his father-in-law's chances of recovery. They had already borrowed against Jessica's jewelry and were considering taking a second mortgage on their house, but the timing was challenging, and the process would take weeks they didn't have. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. The same people who had spent months explaining why my financial strategies were outdated and insufficient were now asking me to rescue them from their own cash flow problems. The family that had assumed I was barely making ends meet on Social Security, and Roberto's pension was looking to me as their solution to a significant financial crisis. I could hear the embarrassment in Michael's voice as he struggled to frame his request. He mentioned that he knew I probably didn't have much available cash, but wondered if I might be able to help with even a small portion of what they needed. He suggested that he could pay me back over time, though he didn't specify exactly how or when such repayment might occur. The awkwardness of the conversation was palpable, made worse by his obvious discomfort at having to ask his elderly mother for money he assumed she probably didn't have. I let him finish his explanation before responding, taking a moment to consider exactly how I wanted to handle this situation. This was an opportunity to demonstrate something important, but I wanted to do it thoughtfully rather than dramatically. I told Michael that I was sorry to hear about Jessica's father, and that I would certainly help however I could. Then I asked him to give me a few hours to review my finances and see what options might be available. The truth was that $30,000 represented less than 2 weeks of investment income for me, a sum I could transfer from my money market account without even touching my long-term investments. But Michael didn't need to know that yet. Instead, I wanted to use this crisis as a teaching moment, an opportunity to reveal some truths about financial planning and emergency preparedness that my family had never bothered to learn. I spent the afternoon making phone calls, not to arrange financing or liquidate investments, but to gather information about the medical situation and the various payment options available to the family. I called the hospital's financial services department and learned about payment plans and hardship programs that might reduce their immediate cash needs. I contacted several medical financing companies that specialized in emergency healthcare funding. I researched the experimental treatments Michael had mentioned to understand their costs and success rates. By evening, I had assembled a comprehensive analysis of their situation and multiple solutions to their problem. More importantly, I had developed a plan that would not only solve their immediate crisis, but also teach them some valuable lessons about emergency preparedness and financial planning. This was my moment to demonstrate that the supposedly outdated grandmother they had been patronizing actually understood money management better than they did. I called Michael back that evening and asked him to bring Jessica to my house the following morning. I told him I had reviewed my situation and believed I could help, but that I wanted to discuss their options in person rather than over the phone. I could hear the relief in his voice, though it was mixed with surprise that I had apparently been able to come up with solutions so quickly. They arrived the next morning looking haggard and anxious, clearly having spent a sleepless night worrying about Jessica's father and their financial predicament. Jessica's eyes were red from crying, and Michael looked like he had aged years. In the past 24 hours. I welcomed them into my living room and offered coffee, which they accepted gratefully. I began by expressing my sympathy for their situation and assuring them that we would find a way to handle the immediate crisis. Then I spread out the research I had compiled, showing them the various financing options available and explaining how each one would work. I had created a detailed comparison chart showing interest rates, repayment terms, and total costs for each alternative, complete with recommendations based on their specific circumstances. Jessica looked confused as she reviewed my analysis, clearly not expecting such a comprehensive and sophisticated approach to their problem. Michael seemed equally surprised, examining the documents with the careful attention of someone who recognized professional quality financial planning when he saw it. Neither of them said anything immediately, but I could see them processing the implications of what they were looking at. I explained that the hospital's hardship program could reduce their immediate costs by about 40% if they qualified, which they almost certainly would based on the information Michael had provided. I showed them how a medical financing company could cover the remaining amount with reasonable terms that would spread the payments over 3 years. The combination of these two approaches would solve their problem without requiring them to mortgage their house or liquidate other investments at unfavorable prices. But then I offered them a third option that really got their attention. I told them that I could simply write them a check for the full $30,000, with no interest and no specific repayment schedule. They could pay me back when it was convenient for them, or not at all if their circumstances made repayment difficult. The offer was genuine, but I could see that it raised questions in their minds about where such money might come from. Jessica was the first to find her voice, asking hesitantly whether I was sure I could afford such a large expenditure. She mentioned her concerns about depleting my savings and suggested that perhaps one of the financing options would be more prudent for someone in my situation. Michael nodded agreement, saying he didn't want me to jeopardize my own financial security to help them with their emergency. I smiled and told them not to worry about my financial situation, that I had reviewed my resources carefully and was confident I could handle this expense without any difficulty. But I could see they were still puzzled about how their supposedly cash-poor grandmother could casually offer to write a $30,000 check. The disconnect between their assumptions about my circumstances and the reality of what I was proposing was finally beginning to register. Michael asked directly whether I was planning to liquidate investments or take out a loan to raise the money. He seemed genuinely concerned about the impact such actions might have on my long-term financial stability. I could see that he was struggling to reconcile his image of me as someone who needed financial guidance with the evidence that I was apparently well prepared for exactly this type of emergency. That's when I decided it was time for a small demonstration of my actual financial capabilities. I excused myself and went to Roberto's office, returning with my most recent investment account statement and a folder containing documentation for my rental properties. I placed these documents on the coffee table in front of them and suggested they might want to review my financial situation before continuing to worry about my ability to help them. The silence that followed was profound. Jessica picked up the investment statement first, her eyes widening as she scanned the account balances and portfolio allocation. Michael leaned over to read along with her, his expression shifting from concern to confusion to something approaching shock. The numbers they were looking at represented wealth far beyond what they had imagined I possessed, managed through strategies more sophisticated than anything they had discussed at Tyler's graduation party. Jessica set down the investment statement and picked up the rental property documentation, reviewing the income statements and property valuations with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a fundamental shift in reality. Michael examined the investment account more closely, noting the diversification across asset classes and the professional management of the portfolio. Neither of them said anything for several minutes as they processed what they were seeing. Finally, Michael looked up at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was a mixture of respect, embarrassment, and genuine curiosity about how he had so completely misunderstood my financial situation. He asked quietly how long I had been managing investments at this level and whether I had been getting professional advice or handling the decisions myself. I explained that I had been learning about investing since shortly after Roberto's death, that I had educated myself through books, seminars, and careful observation of market patterns over many years. I told them about the rental properties I had acquired and managed personally, about the systematic approach I had taken to building wealth while maintaining a modest lifestyle. I described the financial planning strategies I had implemented and the long-term thinking that had guided my decisions. Jessica was shaking her head in apparent disbelief, asking why I had never mentioned any of this during our previous conversations about financial planning. She seemed genuinely confused about why I had allowed her to offer advice about investment strategies when I was clearly far more sophisticated in my approach than she had realized. The irony of her previous attempts to educate me about money management was becoming painfully obvious to everyone in the room. I told them that I had never felt the need to discuss my financial affairs in detail, that I preferred to keep such matters private. I explained that I had listened politely to their advice because I appreciated their concern, even when their suggestions involved strategies I had already considered and often rejected for sound reasons. I mentioned that I had learned early, in my investing career, that people often had strong opinions about other people's money, and that it was easier to avoid such discussions entirely. Michael asked whether I had been offended by their assumptions about my financial sophistication, and whether I had been frustrated by their attempts to offer guidance I didn't need. I assured him that I hadn't taken offense, that I understood their intentions had been good even if their assumptions had been incorrect. But I also explained that the experience had taught me something important about how people perceived me, based on my age and lifestyle choices rather than my actual capabilities. The conversation that followed was unlike any we had ever had. For the first time, they asked me genuine questions about my investment philosophy and financial planning strategies. They wanted to understand how I had educated myself about complex financial topics, how I had developed the confidence to make significant investment decisions, and how I had managed to accumulate substantial wealth while living on what they had assumed was a fixed income. I found myself explaining concepts I had never expected to discuss with them, describing the difference between speculation and investing, the importance of understanding risk versus volatility, and the power of compound growth over extended time periods. They listened with the attention of students rather than the condescension of teachers, asking thoughtful questions and taking notes on investment strategies they had never considered. By the end of our conversation, the immediate crisis that had brought them to my house seemed almost secondary to the larger revelation about my financial capabilities. I wrote them a check for the full $30,000, which they accepted with gratitude, but also with a new understanding of what such generosity represented. This wasn't a sacrifice on my part or a depletion of limited resources. It was simply one wealthy person helping family members through a temporary difficulty. As they prepared to leave, Jessica apologized for the assumptions she had made about my financial situation and for the patronizing advice she had offered at Tyler's graduation party. Michael expressed amazement at how completely he had misunderstood my circumstances and asked whether I would be willing to share more of my financial knowledge with them in the future. Both of them seemed genuinely humbled by the experience of discovering that their supposedly outdated grandmother was actually far more financially sophisticated than they were. I walked them to the door with a sense of satisfaction that went beyond having solved their immediate problem. The demonstration of my actual capabilities had been more effective than any argument or explanation could have been. They had seen documentary evidence of wealth accumulated through exactly the kind of old-fashioned strategies they had assumed were inadequate for modern financial planning. The lesson had been taught not through lectures but through revelation, which made it far more powerful and memorable. After they left, I sat in my living room looking at the investment statements and property documents still scattered across my coffee table. Tomorrow, word of this conversation would spread through the family, and my carefully maintained image as a financially naive elderly woman would be permanently shattered. But that was exactly what I had wanted to achieve. The time for hiding. My capabilities behind false modesty had passed, and the demonstration of my true financial sophistication had been both timely and educational for everyone involved. 6 months after the emergency loan revelation, my life had settled into a new rhythm that felt both familiar and completely transformed. The morning coffee ritual remained the same. The quiet contemplation on my back patio continued unchanged. But everything else had shifted in ways I couldn't have anticipated. The careful facade I had maintained for years was gone, replaced by a transparency that brought both relief and unexpected complications. Jessica's father had recovered fully from his heart attack, a success story that the family credited partly to the quick access to treatment that my financial assistance had made possible. They had repaid the $30,000 within 4 months, not because I had requested it, but because they had restructured their own finances to prioritize emergency preparedness. The crisis had taught them lessons about liquidity and cash flow that my previous gentle suggestions had never managed to convey. More significantly, the revelation of my financial sophistication had triggered a complete transformation in how my family interacted with me. The patronizing advice about money management had disappeared entirely, replaced by respectful questions about investment strategies and market analysis. Michael had started calling me regularly to discuss his portfolio decisions, treating me as a knowledgeable advisor rather than a confused elderly relative who needed guidance. Jessica had been perhaps the most dramatically affected by the discovery of my true circumstances. The woman who had once explained mutual funds to me as if I were a child now sought my opinion on everything from college savings plans to retirement projections. She had enrolled in a financial literacy course at the local community college and frequently shared what she was learning, asking for my perspective on concepts she was encountering for the first time. The shift in dynamics had extended beyond immediate family to the broader social circles where I occasionally appeared. At Tyler's recent 16th birthday celebration, I had found myself surrounded by other parents asking questions about real estate investing and tax-advantaged savings strategies. The invisible grandmother who had once sat quietly in the corner was now someone whose opinions were actively solicited and carefully considered. But perhaps the most meaningful change had occurred in my relationship with Tyler and Emma themselves. They had always been polite and affectionate, but now they showed genuine interest in understanding how I had built wealth and what lessons they might learn from my experience. Tyler had asked me to help him open his first investment account with money from his part-time job, and Emma had started a small business selling handmade jewelry, seeking my advice on pricing and business planning. These conversations with my grandchildren had revealed something I hadn't expected. They were hungry for practical knowledge about money and success, but no one had ever offered to teach them beyond basic budgeting concepts. Their parents had focused on providing them with material advantages, but had never shared the financial literacy that might help them maintain and build upon those advantages independently. I had begun holding informal financial education sessions at my house, starting with Tyler and Emma, but gradually expanding to include some of their friends whose parents had heard about these gatherings. We would sit around my kitchen table on Saturday mornings, discussing everything from compound interest to career planning, using real examples and hands-on exercises that made abstract concepts concrete and actionable. These sessions had evolved into something larger than I had initially intended. Word had spread through the community about the elderly woman who was teaching practical financial skills to teenagers, and I had started receiving requests from other families who wanted their children to participate. What had begun as informal conversations with my grandchildren had grown into a structured program that now included more than 20 regular participants. The success of these educational efforts had caught the attention of Sarah Chen, a financial advisor who worked with several families in my neighborhood. She had approached me about formalizing the program, possibly partnering with local schools to reach more students who could benefit from early financial education. The idea intrigued me, particularly because it aligned with the charitable foundation I had established through my revised estate planning. The foundation itself had become operational sooner than I had expected. Rather than waiting until after my death to begin its work, I had decided to fund it while I was still alive and able to guide its development. The organization now provided grants to women over 50 who wanted to start businesses or return to school, funded financial literacy programs in senior centers, and supported research into age discrimination in financial services. Managing. The foundation had given me a public platform I had never sought, but found surprisingly fulfilling. I had been invited to speak at conferences about women and financial empowerment, sharing my story of building wealth later in life and challenging assumptions about what elderly women could accomplish. These speaking engagements had connected me with other women who had similar experiences of being underestimated and dismissed despite their actual capabilities. One of the most rewarding aspects of this new visibility had been the letters I received from women across the country who had heard my story and been inspired to take control of their own financial futures. Many of them were widows who had allowed their adult children to manage their affairs, only to discover that their well-meaning families had made assumptions about their capabilities that were both limiting and incorrect. These women wrote to thank me for demonstrating that age and gender didn't have to be barriers to financial sophistication, that it was possible to educate yourself about investing and wealth management regardless of your starting point. Some had enrolled in investment courses, others had fired financial advisors who had been condescending or dismissive, and many had begun asserting themselves more confidently in family financial discussions. The media attention had been unexpected, but generally positive. A local newspaper had written a feature article about my foundation and educational programs, which had been picked up by several national publications. The story had resonated with readers who were dealing with their own experiences of ageism and assumptions about elderly competence. I had appeared on 2 television programs discussing financial empowerment for seniors, experiences that had been simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Through all of these changes, my core investment philosophy had remained constant. I continued to focus on long-term value creation rather than short-term market movements. I maintained my diversified portfolio of dividend-paying stocks, municipal, bonds, and real estate investments. I still lived modestly, not because I had to, but because I had learned that happiness didn't correlate directly with spending levels. The rental properties continued to provide steady income while appreciating in value, validating my decision to invest in real estate when everyone else was focused on more glamorous alternatives. My tenants had become something like extended family, reliable people who took care of the properties and provided me with both income and purpose. Several of them had expressed interest in eventually purchasing their homes, and I had been working with a mortgage broker to help them access financing when they were ready. My relationship with Michael and Jessica had stabilized into something healthier and more honest than what we had shared before. They no longer felt obligated to offer me financial advice I didn't need, and I no longer felt compelled to hide my capabilities to avoid making them uncomfortable. We could discuss money matters openly, sharing information and perspectives without the underlying tension that had characterized our previous interactions. The grandchildren had become genuine financial planning partners, involving me in decisions about their college funding and career development in ways that felt natural rather than forced. Tyler had decided to study business and economics, partly inspired by our conversations about investing and entrepreneurship. Emma had expanded her jewelry business and was now selling products online, using marketing strategies we had developed together during our Saturday morning sessions. But perhaps the most significant change had been internal, a shift in how I saw myself and my place in the world. For years, I had accepted the role of the invisible elderly woman, present but not particularly relevant to important family decisions. I had allowed others to define my capabilities based on their assumptions about age and gender, rather than my actual knowledge and experience. Now I understood that visibility and respect weren't things that could be given or taken away by others. They were things I could claim for myself by simply refusing to accept limitations that weren't based in reality. I had stopped apologizing for my success and started sharing my knowledge openly. I had stopped hiding my wealth and started using it to create opportunities for others who faced similar challenges. The updated will remained in Mr. Thompson's safe, though its provisions were no longer secret. I had shared the broad outlines of my estate planning with my family, explaining how my assets would be distributed and why I had made the choices I had made. The conversation had been difficult but necessary, helping them understand that my decisions were based on values and principles rather than disappointment or vindictiveness. Michael and Jessica had been surprised, but ultimately supportive of my decision to leave the majority of my wealth to charitable causes rather than family inheritance. They had come to understand that their children would benefit more from the financial education and life skills I was providing than from simply inheriting money they hadn't learned to manage responsibly. The house remained my sanctuary, but it had also become a gathering place for the extended community of women and young people who were part of my various educational and charitable efforts. The kitchen table where I had once sat alone reviewing investment statements now hosted regular meetings of scholarship recipients, business mentorship sessions, and financial planning workshops. My story had become something larger than just my own experience of being underestimated and proving my worth. It had become a catalyst for conversations about how society treats elderly women, how assumptions about capability can become self-fulfilling prophecies, and how it's never too late to claim the respect and recognition you deserve. As I sat on my back patio this morning, watching the familiar heron wade through the canal water, I reflected on how much had changed since that graduation party revelation 6 months ago. I was still the same person who had quietly built wealth while others assumed I was struggling financially. But now I was also someone whose voice was heard and valued, whose experience was seen as worthy of respect rather than patronizing tolerance. The morning coffee tasted the same. The Florida sunshine felt as warm as ever, and the peaceful rhythm of life by the water continued unchanged. But everything else had been transformed by the simple act of refusing to hide who I really was. I had updated more than just my will. I had updated my entire relationship with the world, claiming my place as someone whose wisdom and experience deserved recognition rather than dismissal. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to teach, to share, and to demonstrate that age was just a number when it came to capability and relevance. But today, I would simply enjoy the satisfaction of knowing that I had found the courage to show my family and community exactly what this supposedly outdated grandmother was actually capable of accomplishing. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.